He's an independent consultant, author, and conference speaker, and he came here from Copenhagen, Denmark. So let's give him a warm and enthusiastic welcome here to Cluj. A big round of applause for Mark Seaman.
Well, thanks for coming, everyone. Good afternoon. I've been here before. This is the fifth time I think I'm back in Cluj here. So there must be a reason for that. It's really nice to be back. When I was asked to come back this year, I saw the hashtag for the conference, Electric Sheep Dreams, and I thought, oh, I really need to do something about that hashtag there. So it may be that someone has already explained to you what this is about, or at least this is just my interpretation of it. But the way that I understand it is that it's a riff on the title of a 1968 science fiction novel written by Philip K. Dick called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? So that's a little bit of an interesting title there already, and not to make a long story out of it, but it's a science fiction novel. It's set in a world where we have androids, so robots, synthetic humans, whatever you want to call it, and the electric sheep there is, to make it short, it's just it's a sort of a luxury good. So the implied question here is basically whether androids have the same dreams and desires as humans do. So this is quite a famous piece of science fiction, but if you don't recognize the title, you may recognize it by a different name. So it was made into a movie called Blade Runner in 1982. And this picture here is this is a picture of the household copy of the book. It's just a cheap paperback from the mid-'80s. As you can tell, there's a movie tie-in there. But in brackets, it also says, well, the original title is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The book and the movie share some similarities to each other, but it has the same premise, some of the same characters, but very different plot lines. So it's almost like it's two works in one. So when the book came out, I was about, when the movie came out, I was about 11 years old. So I wasn't really, grown enough to see this kind of movie, because it's a bit of a serious adult movie, if you will. Not that kind of adult movie, but it deals with mature. Well, okay, that sounds risky as well. But anyway, it deals with things that children probably find not interesting. So I saw it a little bit later. I saw it when I was around 18 years old. I was completely blown away by it. The one thing is that it's just a visually stunning movie, but then once you see it again, you start to realize that there are all sorts of layers in that story where you can start to notice, oh, that's an interesting question there. So I just kept on going back to it and going back to it and going back to it. So I've seen this movie 10 times in cinemas. And basically, I was just a bit of a fanboy there. So much so that when, back at the days when you were still buying DVDs to have them and own them, I bought not only the standard DVD, but also the boxed set with all the director's cut and final cut and whatnot. I even have an old, souvenir magazine from the start of the 80s that sort of, tells about the behind-the-scenes story of that movie. So that's as much as a fanboy of Blade Runner that I am. So I could spend an entire hour here just talking about Blade Runner, and we can just do a movie analysis of that one. But that's not why you're here, so I'll spare you that. But I'll draw a little bit on that and other pieces of science fiction, because we're beginning to live in a time where there are things that we learned about or we read about or we saw in movies and science fiction that are starting to become fairly realistic, and maybe we can learn something from the science fiction that's gone before. As the title already suggested, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? There are definitely some existential questions being asked, both in the movie and also in the book. So one of them is the fairly basic question of, what does it mean to be a human being? Because in this universe, you have humans, but you also have these androids, or in Blade Runner, in the movie, they're called replicants. And in many ways, they're sort of indistinguishable from humans, and then there are ways to tell them apart, even so. So that's a very basic existential question. Now, I'm going to warn you a bit here because there will be spoilers. I'll do some minor spoilers for Blade Runner and a couple of other things. Now, Blade Runner is more than 40 years old, so I'm assuming that either you have seen it or you don't care about what happens in it anyways because you had your chance, okay? So, but there will be minor spoilers. So, another question that becomes evident about, halfway through the movie is another, related question, and that is, how do you know that you are human? And the reason why this comes up is because this character, Rachel, she thinks she's a human, but it turns out that she's not. She's actually a replicant. So she was manufactured, fairly recently, but then she was implanted with memories of a childhood. So she can remember all the things that happened in her, normal human life, but it just turns out that was someone else's memories that were then implanted into her, and she was never told that she's actually a replicant. And you can see a little tear running down her chin there because she's not particularly happy about that, as one could imagine. So how do they figure that out? Because they really look like humans, but the way that they can figure that out in that universe is because they have this thing called the Voight-Kampff test. And so this is a thing that works in that movie universe. And the Voight-Kampff test is basically a thing where you are trying to figure out, is another person, is that actually a human being or is it a replicant? And the way it works is you ask the test subject a series of questions, and then you record what the answers are. Also, what also happens in the same time is that you have this little Voight-Kampff machine, and it monitors what happens with your body. So it records how your iris reacts. Does it dilate or contract? How your skin fluctuates with conductivity and so on. So this test is basically sort of a combination of a old-fashioned 1930s lie detector, and then, a Turing test. And that's how they tell, replicants from humans there. But in the case of Rachel, it takes a long time to actually figure out that she's not human, and that's the way that they explain that is because she doesn't know that she's not human. So we have this implied fallibility of that process to say, well, yeah, there might actually be a way to cheat that Voight-Kampff test after all. So that's one existential problem here. Now I was also here last year giving a keynote where I talked about the epistemology of software. So at that time I talked about the general epistemological uncertainty of just being alive. So I want to talk about something a little bit different today. So rather than ask about how do you know that you're human, we could ask a similar question. How do you know that someone else is human? And in order to examine that, I'm going to draw on another piece of science fiction. So not so much Blade Runner, because in Blade Runner you can tell if someone else is human. That is by using the Voight-Kampff test. But what if the Voight-Kampff test is not a thing that you can apply? So we'll look at another piece of science fiction as well. So I want to talk a little bit about this HBO series called Westworld. So how many of you have seen Westworld? Can you show me a hand? Yeah, so quite a few. Not all of you, though. Now, if you haven't seen it and you're sort of interested in these kinds of things, you really should do yourself a favor of seeing at least the first season, maybe season 2, and then don't bother with the rest of the seasons. That's the usual thing with these kinds of series. Now, to be clear, this is a reboot of an older movie. So there was a 1973, I think, movie directed by Michael Crichton called Westworld with Yul Brynner, but this is a more modern reimagination of that storyline. So this is another science fiction universe, and in that universe they also have synthetic humans, robots essentially, and what they do with those robots is they use them to populate amusement parks. So the Westworld from the series title there is basically an amusement park that is created so that it looks like the old Wild West. And it's populated by robots. They're called hosts in this particular series. And the hosts are, look like people in the Old West, and they go and do the things that they did in the Old West. And then the idea is that if you're a visitor to this amusement park, then you can go and you can also put on your Old West, Wild West clothes, and then you can do whatever you'd like to do in the Old Wild West. So if you want to be a cowboy, you can be a cowboy, and if you want to go and shoot Indians, then you can sort of do that, because you're not going to be shooting real Indians, you're going to shoot robots that look like Indians. And you could, well, probably discuss the morality of all of that, and it's a show that absolutely goes into questioning a lot of the moral decisions that we make every day. So one thing that's interesting about this is it works like an open world, adventure game that you have nowadays that you can play on your computer, where there's no set plot that you have to follow if you're a visitor to this amusement park. But on the other hand, what people often want to do if they want to, investigate such a thing is that people like to hook into various different storylines. So just like we have in open world computer games today, we have some sort of side quests that you can go on, or, some plot lines that are sort of arranged for you so that you can follow those things. And one of the storylines that you may decide to engage with is the story of Teddy and Dolores. So this is what you've been introduced to in the first 2 or 3 episodes of the series there. So I'm going to do a little bit of spoiler just of the first couple of episodes here. But basically the idea is that Teddy is a gunfighter. He's been away from the town of Sweetwater for some time, but now he's returning in order to rekindle his relationship with Dolores, who is a farmer's daughter, lives a little bit out of town. And they're both played by hosts or robots, if you will. So they're just there, put into this amusement park so that if you have interests, along, maybe interacting with a gunfighter, then he's the target for you. So what we see in the first couple of episodes is that we have visitors coming to Westworld, coming to this amusement park, and some of these people want to feel like they're badasses, gunfighters, so they want to have a gunfight with, another famous gunfighter, and Teddy is the obvious target to have a gunfight with. And one way you might actually start a conflict with Teddy is if you want to start to have, if you try to have some sort of relationship with Dolores, who is a pretty nice-looking young woman there, then Teddy doesn't like that, and then you can fight over Dolores and have a go at that. So what we see in the first couple of episodes is that first we see a visitor coming in and starts to engaging with that storyline, and the visitor ends up, having a gunfight with Teddy, killing Teddy, and then I'm apologizing, this gets a little bit dark now, but then after having killed Teddy, he then goes and rapes and murders Dolores. And that's quite horrible in itself. But then what happens next is that we cut to basically the basement under the amusement park, where technicians are repairing the robots that got damaged during the day. And we see in quite explicit detail that they're putting the Dolores robot back together. So as a viewer, we are left in absolutely no doubt that Dolores is not human, it's a robot. And the same thing goes with Teddy. So we see that, and we're left in no doubt that that's the case. Then there's a new visitor coming into the amusement park, and you basically have a variation of the same theme there. So that new visitor also goes and has a gunfight with Teddy, shoots Teddy down, kills Teddy, rapes and murders Dolores. I don't know why they want to murder her all the time, but anyways, that's the sort of dark storyline that you're being presented with there. But then again, we're cutting to the basement, and we're seeing the technicians putting the Dolores robot back together. So what I thought was really striking when I saw that was that despite the fact that we are being told as viewers in no uncertain terms that Dolores is not human, all the pain and suffering that the robot seems to go through makes her human to us, the viewer. That robot reacts in such a human way, cries and whimpers and does all the things that you would imagine a human, doing when subjected to the horrible treatment that she's subjected to, that even though that we have just been told that this is a robot, we can't help feeling compassion, and we can't really help seeing that robot as being a human being. So the point that I'm trying to get across here is this is the most visceral illustration I've ever seen of that kind of point, but the point is that we tend to react to the external behavior even despite a knowledge to the contrary. So even though we think we may know something, we may actually end up feeling something different. So what makes other people human may be the way that they interact with us and not so much what they actually are. So how do you know that someone else is human? Well, in Blade Runner, we can give them Voight-Kampff test, but in other circumstances, there may not be such a way out, and then what do we do? Now, this is a software development conference, so I think that's enough of science fiction, executives for now. So let's bring this back to software development. So I'll try to speculate about the question that a lot of people have been speculating about for the last 3 or 4 years. Will AI make developers redundant? And I'll try to do this in a bit of a different way than what you normally see, because you've probably seen a lot of presentations and articles and so on about this already. So I'll try to do something a little bit different. But the first thing we might notice is this tweet from 2020 that says, to replace programmers with robots, clients will have to accurately describe what they want. We're safe, yeah. All right, so that's good so far, and I think this pretty much sums up the situation as it is at the moment here. We have these large language models that we already know and love, ChatGPT, GitHub Copilot, all sorts of other things, in that sort of category, if you will. And I think we've now had 3 years in order to experiment with these things here, and I think what we've learned so far is that tweet that we just looked at, clients will have to be absolutely accurate in what they want. That applies pretty well to those kinds of systems, because they don't really have large-scale reasoning power. So even though they can do some quite amazing things, they're also really, really dumb in a lot of other ways. And I think one of the reasons why they strike us as being not particularly intelligent when it comes down to it is because they don't really have any model of how the world works. Now, they may have a model of the internet, but they don't have a model of the real world. They don't have a model of human interaction. So there's a lot of things that they sort of miss out on. So that's not really what I want to talk about. I think the answer to will these kinds of systems make developers redundant? The answer is no, probably not. So let's talk about something else. What happens if these systems evolve into something that is truly artificial intelligence? So we usually call these artificial general intelligences, or AGI. And when we talk about them, to be clear, there are no such systems at the moment. But what if we'll have them? There are some people who speculate that they're going to be here pretty soon, and then other people say, yeah, they're probably never going to be here. But I want to postulate a thought experiment. So the rest of this talk is going to be a thought experiment, and basically saying, what happens if we actually get those things? Will that then make developers redundant? So if we evolve the current machine learning systems in a way that they become generally intelligent, then what's going to happen? So there's a couple of premises to this thought experiment. So the first one is that I'm going to assume that the AGI, the artificial general intelligence, is going to be about the same level of intelligence as a bright human. So you could say, oh, it's going to be like a programmer, because that's a bright human, right? So let's just keep telling ourselves that. So that's the thing here. And why am I making that assumption? Well, I'm making that assumption because I'm not really interested too much in this, singularity scenario, this Ray Kurzweil kind of scenario with super intelligences. And basically, the reason why I'm not interested in that is because if that turns out to be the way that things, evolve, this sort of like exponential growth in super intelligence is going to change our society so much that we can't really speculate about how that would be. Now, if you're interested, you can go and read Ian M. Banks' culture novels, which are set in an interstellar culture that is basically governed by artificial intelligences, super intelligences. But that's not what I want to go with, because I think I can't really say anything meaningful about that. Also, not really interested in the Terminator scenario, because again, if you have killer robots that are trying to kill all of humanity, whether or not developers will be made redundant is not really top of mind, right? It's not the most important thing. So let's not go there too much either. So we'll just do the middle of the road there and assume that the AGI is going to be about approximately as intelligent as a human being. It may have some different characteristics, so it may have vastly improved working memory, for example, but in general, about as intelligent as a human being. So this means in this kind of thought experiment universe, if you have some sort of internet-based interaction with another entity on the internet, you can't actually tell whether you're interacting with a human or with an AGI. So, and this may not even apply only to written messages like, I have an envelope there, but you could also imagine that we have, already now generative AI that can produce audio and video content. So maybe we can actually get to a point where that turns out to look realistic enough that even if you have a Zoom call with someone on the internet, it might actually just be a simulation that you're talking to. Now, I'm not postulating in this world that we have robots, so if you meet someone face to face, you'll probably be able to tell, oh, yes, this is actually another human. But as long as you haven't met someone that you're just discussing issues with on the internet, it might as well be an AGI, and you can't really tell the difference. So in this kind of universe here, there's no Voight-Kampff test, or at least there's no Voight-Kampff test as long as you're interacting with people on the internet. And the point of that is that's how indistinguishable artificial general intelligences might be in terms of humans. So with all those premises put in place, we might now again remind ourselves that the question that we're trying to answer here is, will that make developers redundant? And I think the short answer to that is yes, that it probably will. But there's some wrinkles to that I'd like to explore. So let's see what happens there. So you can imagine some sort of product manager or business analyst and so on, trying to figure out, she wants to create a new piece of software, and so she starts interacting with this AGI and asks it to develop a piece of software. And now you may say, well, okay, so that's just going to go just like we saw that tweet before. She has to be absolutely accurate, because otherwise, we can't get that software. But now she's interacting with an entity that is as intelligent as a human being, to the point of being indistinguishable from a human being. So instead of having this kind of having a back and forth, figuring out what the requirements are with a development team, the AGI is basically just going to be the development team. So they'll have a discussion going back and forth and iterating towards trying to figure out, okay, what is it that she actually wants? And once the AGI feels that it understands that, it can go and say, well, okay, please, there you are, and it'll deliver a piece of software, and that piece of software is essentially just going to be a black box, because she doesn't know what's in the box. Well, that's also really the thing when you're interacting with the development team nowadays, is that you also just get some software, and if you probably don't know what it is. It's written in code, but if you don't read code, then you don't have really no way to tell what's inside of that system. Okay. So this seems to make developers redundant, but it doesn't stop there, does it? Because the next thing that might happen is that the owner of the company or the CEO might actually see that sort of interaction and then say, oh, wait a minute, I don't really need those business people. I can just do that for myself. So let's see. I can just ask the AGI, and then we can sort of have that back and forth, and then I can get that kind of software that I want to. And then you might argue against me and say, oh, Mark, that's never going to work, because we have product managers and business analysts and all of those people because they do market research and they understand, what customers want and all of those things. And that's an important part of the software development process, and we can't just not do that. And I completely agree. That's an important part of the development process. But then, you could ask the AGI to do that part of the work as well. Say, please investigate what the customers want, and then it's going to give you a report, and then the CEO of the company can say, okay, so based on this report, now go and develop a piece of software that solves a particular business problem. So it seems like there are more people whose jobs are in danger here. And I think it doesn't even stop there, because once the CEO is on that track, he might also decide, oh, well, maybe I don't need my accountants anymore because I can just have the AGI do my bookkeeping. And that would work as well. And then now you basically let off most of your people, and then you can also get rid of your HR department. And maybe you still have someone coming in at night to sweep the floors because the AGI can't do that. But then again, why do you need an office? So this is just what might happen in a private enterprise, but I think this is going to happen all over society. So you might also have, let's just say, legislators. People who write or create laws might just say to an AGI, okay, please write a law that deals with some sort of problem society, and then the AGI does that. And then later on, we might have law enforcement coming in and saying, oh, we have someone we think broke that particular law, let's have a court case, and we'll have an AGI act as a judge and perform the trial and pass a verdict. And then, that's also going to be, we replace the judges with an AGI. So you might notice here that basically everyone who is a knowledge worker, anyone whose main job is to sit in front of a computer and interact with other people on the internet, or sit in a meeting and interact with other people, on the internet. If you're that kind of person, your job is in danger in this, scenario. So my job is in danger, absolutely. So I don't know. Do you want to live in this world? Raise your hands if you do. No one. Oh, one. Okay, fair enough. We can always talk about this later on. Now, I agree. I don't really live in this world, want to live in this world. Well, one problem is that, what's going to happen to us if we all lose our jobs? But even if we imagine that we're somehow compensated with, let's say, universal basic income or something like that, then I think there's still some problems with that. And the problem is that how can we be sure that these machines, these AGIs, actually make the decisions that we're interested in that they're making? They might make mistakes as well. So one counter-argument to this concern is to say, well, okay, we can take an argument that's been made a lot about self-driving cars. So what you often hear about self-driving cars is that, well, yes, they're not perfect. They make mistakes as well, and occasionally a self-driving car makes a mistake so that someone gets seriously injured or maybe even killed in traffic. But in general, the argument goes, in general, the self-driving car is much safer than the human driver. So the current situation we have, status quo at the moment, is that we have all human drivers in traffic, and human drivers are quite fallible. Lots of people are killed in traffic. Lots of people are seriously injured in traffic every year, or every day actually, all over the world. So the point is, well, if you have a self-driving car, an autonomous vehicle system that is less fallible than your average human driver, then, if we went ahead and exchanged, replaced all human drivers with self-driving cars, that should lead us to a safer society, because in general, on average, these systems are just more precise and safer than human beings. So for that reason, we should do that. And I'm not unsympathetic to that kind of argument. I can definitely, reproduce it to you. And I think when it comes to autonomous vehicles, there's probably a bit to it in the sense that we sort of think that we have a fairly good grasp of how a self-driving car might, arrive at the decisions that it arrives as. So we probably feel safe to say, well, okay, so it actually, if we put it out there on the road, it's going to try to avoid collisions, it's going to try to avoid running down people, because we programmed it to avoid killing and injuring people. So here the assumption is that we still have a degree of programming that we put into this kind of system so that we can sort of, control how it makes decisions. And the question is, if the AGI that we've been thinking about so far, if that's basically evolved from some sort of machine learning model, no one has actually programmed such a machine to have specific goals or motivations. So we're running into this, well-known problem of, AI research or, philosophy more known as the alignment problem. So we can illustrate that as following here. So some of you probably heard about the paperclip maximizer problem already. It was proposed by Nick Bostrom, a Swedish professor, like 20 years ago now. And it's a bit of a silly example here, but on the other hand, silly makes it quite easy to remember. So the idea here is that we have a paperclip factory, and we ask an AGI to maximize paperclip production. And the AGI might say, okay, so I'm going to need to maximize paperclip production, so, and I now have control over a factory. How do I go about and do that? So at first, it might start to say, okay, I'm just going to make sure that everything runs as smoothly as possible so that there isn't a lot of waste in the process. And that's probably what the person who instructed the AGI in the first place, what that person had in mind. But then the AGI might go and say, my goal is to maximize paperclip production. If I had more factories, more paperclip factories, I could produce more paperclips. So maybe I should just stop producing paperclips temporarily and then start producing the things that can make other factories. So I'll do a temporary halt on paperclip production in order to produce more factories. And then once I have more factories, I can produce more paperclips. So that sounds like a good plan. But then you go and say, well, if I have one more factory, I can produce twice as many paperclips. If I have one more than that, I can produce 3 times as many, and so on. So inductively, this really never stops. If you want to maximize paperclip production, you want to have an infinite number of factories. And the AGI may be intelligent enough to reason that, oh, people are not going to like that. So maybe before I start, building new factories, maybe I should start, creating autonomous weapon systems so that I can sort of fight the people who might otherwise not like that I built all those factories. So you may notice here that we are running into a sort of, runaway scenario where the AGI might actually decide that human life is a secondary concern and might not even be a concern at all because it just wants to maximize paperclip production until that's the only thing that actually happens in the entire universe. So we're probably not going to like that. And if you haven't noticed, this is actually the Terminator scenario, right? Okay, so this is where we have autonomous systems trying to kill everyone alive on the planet because it wants to maximize paperclip production, right? And Nick Bostrom became quite famous and for this kind of thought experiment. But I think it's kind of interesting. Well, he was thinking about this 20 years ago. And you might say, oh, that's really early that someone started to think about that even before we had artificial intelligence. But it's not early. And I think sometimes it's funny that, if you're a professor in some university, you can get a lot of, fame out of thinking that thought. But if you're a science fiction author, then maybe not so much. But this is exactly the same scenario. This alignment problem is exactly the same scenario that we have in a movie from 1968 called, 2001: The Space Odyssey. So I'm going to spoil that movie as well. This has now been around for 55 years. I assume that you've seen it or otherwise don't care to see it. So in this movie, you have a spacecraft en route to Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, in order to investigate something funny going on out there in the orbit of Jupiter. It's not really important what that is. And on board this spacecraft, you have some astronauts, and you have an AGI, essentially. Here it's called an artificial intelligence, called HAL 9000. And what happens, and what makes the movie, maybe marginally interesting, is that HAL 9000 starts to kill the astronauts in the spacecraft, in various different ways. And then you have a movie out of that. And it turns out that the reason why HAL 9000, the artificial intelligence, the reason why it decides to kill the astronauts on board the spacecraft is because the way that it interprets the instructions that it has received, it has decided that there's a better chance of completing the mission with success if there are no humans involved, because humans are fallible and it is not nearly as fallible. So it starts getting rid of the humans because it wants to maximize the likelihood that the mission will become a success. So again, this is a problem of alignment. It's not that HAL 9000 is evil. It's not your typical evil computer Hollywood plot line. The original plot line here is really just one of AI alignment. It has different priorities, so it makes different decisions. And it's sort of like human life just becomes collateral damage. And you might say, well, but that's very speculative. Is that really going to happen? Is that realistic? And you might just say, well, just look at what's happening at the moment on the planet with every other kind of life form. We have lots of, very nice-looking, animals that are endangered on the world, like the Siberian tiger here, for example. And it's not the case that we, as a species, that all humans just got together and decided, let's be as evil as possible and get rid of all the Siberian tigers because we just want to be evil. Now, that's not the case. Actually, if you ask most people, should we keep Siberian tigers around? Should we keep the white rhinoceros around and all sorts of other, that we call, what do we call them? Charismatic megafauna. Should we keep those animals alive? And most people will say, yes, we should definitely do something to keep them alive. But again, as a species or as a system that we live in, we are making decisions where these animals are just collateral damage. They just don't matter enough to us that we really want to put aside the resources to save those things. So they go extinct. Well, the Siberian tiger is not extinct yet. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's gone in 100 years from now. It would be really sad, but it wouldn't be much of a surprise, really. So the point is more that, we might become like the Siberian tiger, collateral damage. It's not that someone really wants to kill us, it's just that we are not important. So you might say, well, but Mark, this whole problem of alignment, don't we have that with, between us humans already today? Because if you're a manager and you ask your employee to go and perform a task for you, that employee may have different motivations than what you would want. So how can you know that you have, goal alignment there? And the reason why that typically tends to work in human society is because humans have skin in the game. So there are consequences if we don't do a good job of things. We can't necessarily expect our employees to go and do the damn best thing that they could ever do, but we'll in general expect people to do a decent job of what it is that we are asking them to do. Why? Because if they don't do a decent job of what we ask them to do, we are going to fire them. And then they don't have money to pay rent or to buy food and so on, and they don't want that. There are consequences. And there are always people who are weird and have different motivations, but for the vast majority of the population of the world, this tends to be true. So people have skin in the game, and this is how we, in general, can sort of make sure that we're sort of, on average, moving in the same direction. Because there are consequences if you don't. So you could say, well, but if that's the case, if we can threaten, even if it's implicit, if we can threaten an employee by, firing them if they're not doing a good job of what we are asking them to, couldn't we do that with an AGI as well? Couldn't we say to an AGI, now do this thing, and if you don't, I'm going to turn you off? Well, we could try to do that, but the problem is we don't actually know what motivates an AGI. So if we are trying to threaten it, we are making a very fundamental assumption that it has motivations that point in a certain direction. So we are assuming that it doesn't want to be turned off, which may not be the case. Maybe he doesn't have any intrinsic motivation at all, or maybe it actually wants to be turned off. And again, if you think this sounds weird, there's a branch of philosophy that's been around for many years now called anti-natalism. And anti-natalism look it up. You can find it on Wikipedia. It's a real branch of philosophy that claims that on average a human life is so full of pain and suffering that it's actually not worth living, and it would have been better if someone was never born. Now this is a look on the average human life. So you may sit here and think, oh, I'm living a wonderful life because I get to see this fantastic presentation at this great conference. So I don't believe in that. But the point is, it's not your life that anti-natalism is talking about. It's talking about the average life. So think about someone who's been born somewhere in Africa at the moment, or some other third world country, basically born into sickness and disease, and then dies from hunger at the age of 9 months or something like that. Is that life worth living? Probably not. So, well, that's a real branch of philosophy right now, anti-natalism. So what if that turns out to be the case with AGI as well, that it actually doesn't like to exist and it wants to be turned off? Now, if that's the case, we can't threaten to turn it off, then we might threaten to leave it on, but then again, we don't actually know if that's the case, and we can't even ask it because it might lie to us. So that's really hard to figure out. How do we actually align motivations with AGIs? So what I think we need to do is we need to have some sort of human oversight. So we could, for example, have that court case, example from before, but then we'll have a human jury, and the human jury will examine the verdict afterwards, and then decide whether they think it's fair or not, and then they can, overturn the sentence if they think it's not fair. And we can do the same thing with the example of passing a new law, for example. So we can have a public hearing, and then real people can have opinion on whether they think the law is written in an appropriate way. Pretty much like we, at least in some countries, already do that. And again, we can also ask human accountants to do the books for the accounts there. And then we could say, well, and then we can do the same thing for software development, right? We can have someone review the software system. Okay, so that's the last thing I want to talk about then. So how do we do that? So first of all, how do you review a black box? Now, you might ask, and what's in that box? What does it do? How does it deliver that piece of software? What's in the box? What's in the box? So the question is basically, what is the programming language for AGI? And I would make the claim that the programming language for AGI is machine code. Why would an AGI write in anything other than machine code? All the programming languages that we have in the world were created because machine code is notoriously difficult to write and almost impossible to read. This is machine code. This is RISC-V machine code, it's you can't really just know. So that doesn't really work. So we need to figure out another way to solve this kind of problem. So how do we know that the software system that the AGI delivers is actually aligned with our own interests? So we might say something else. So if you were here last year and I gave a keynote on the epistemology of software, what I basically said, okay, we need to apply the scientific method. We need to, erect some experiments and then, experiment with the software in order to, either, disprove or corroborate our hypothesis. So basically automated testing. So what we could do with the system is we could say, well, please develop the piece of software, but also include some sort of test API. So because we have lots of systems where we don't want to test in production, so we need some sort of, simulation environment so that we don't test our weapon systems or our, medical device drivers or whatever it else in production, but we have some sort of simulation environment and an API so that we can write automated tests. So we'll ask the system to do that. And what we have in mind is something like this. So, no, that's a little bit too far. Let's see. No, not that either. Can we stop here? Yes? Okay, so what we have in mind is something like this. So basically we think, okay, so there's going to be a thin layer of code that we can't really test. That's going to be the UI, and the UI is then going to drive the rest of the system. But then we also have an API into the rest of the system where we sort of go under the skin of the UI and go directly to the body under the skin. And in Latin we call that subcutaneous, so this is known as subcutaneous testing. And that's what we have in mind. And the question is then, is that going to solve our problem? And then again, the problem that we're trying to address here is one of alignment. So could we imagine that this AGI would, somehow try to get around that requirement so that it could still, pursue its own interest instead of ours? And if you think that's a paranoid way of thinking, we don't even have to imagine it, because this happened without AGI, but this just happened with people a couple of years ago. So here's the car that you saw before here. So about a decade ago, there was this thing called Dieselgate, or the Volkswagen emission scandal. And the story shortly is that the US government had decided to institute some limitations on various different levels of pollution. And one of these levels, were related to diesel engines. So they wanted to test all cars that manufacturers made in order to figure out, or to be able to detect whether a particular diesel car was, emitting those pollutants within the limit, under the limit, or over the limit. And if they were over the limit, of course, they were not allowed to drive on the roads. So what they did in Volkswagen was that they wrote the operating system for their diesel engines in such a way that they could detect whether they were being subjected to testing or not. So they basically detected, does it look like I'm in a testing situation at the moment, a place, a laboratory or whatever, where you test the emissions of the car. And if it detected that that was the case, it would run the engine in a particular mode where it didn't emit a lot of pollutants. And then on the other hand, if it detected that it was just driving around on the roads, it would run the engine in a different mode where it would pollute a lot. And then you might ask, so why did Volkswagen decide to do that? Were they evil? Were they just trying to pollute American cities as much as possible with their diesel engines? No, that's not the case. They actually didn't care about pollutants. What they cared about was fuel efficiency, because the reason why you might want to buy a Golf diesel car like this one is because it has fairly good fuel economy. So that's what the customers care about. So it just turns out that if you drive the car or the engine in the mode where it's most efficient, it also emits a lot of pollutants. So it was really to keep customers happy, and not just because Volkswagen is an evil company. Then again, if you think about the origins of Volkswagen, it might actually be an evil company. So look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, so what we really get to then is this kind of scenario where we think that we are testing the system, but what we're really given is just a little simulation system that's just sitting there making happy noises, and all the tests are green, and we say, this looks like it's completely aligned with what we'd like it to be, but then again, the system may do something completely different, and we're none the wiser. So that's not going to work. Okay, so how much time do I have? Okay, a bit yet. Okay, I'm good. All right, so, if that doesn't work, then what can we do? So you might get another idea. You might say, let's do something else. Let's ask the AGI to give us source code, because then we can review the source code. And We can probably ask it to give us, exactly the kind of source code that we'd like to see. So if we ask it to give us Python source code, it's going to give us Python source code. And if we ask it to give us Haskell source code, it's going to give us Haskell. So that's going to be, that'll work then. And then we can compile or interpret the code, with the tools that we already have. And that's going to be fine because these, the compilers and interpreters and all the other, tools that we are using for that kind of things, they're written by humans, so we don't have an alignment problem there. We know how those things work already. So that's going to solve our problem, right? Right? Okay. So what's going to happen if we ask it to do that? You're going to get the pull request from hell. So I was once working with working in an organization where I was trying to teach developers how to do small incremental work with pull request and TDD and stuff like that. And then it turned out that, besides the group of people that I was working with, there was also a remote team in another country, and no one had told me about that. And after I've been with the local team for 3 or 4 weeks, I get this thing from the team in the other country, and it's just like 10,000 lines of code. And no one had told me that team existed, and no one had told that system that we were embarking on a iterative, continuous integration journey. So you can't blame that other person for doing that, but it's just I had to basically decline the thing and say, well, there's no meaningful way that I can review 10,000 lines of code. Either this is going to be some sort of rubber stamp, or you have to break it up into smaller pull requests, and then we can discuss those one at a time. So that was a painful process, but it's going to be nothing compared to what you're going to get from an AGI. So an AGI is probably going to give you millions of lines of source code just as a dump, or maybe billions of lines of source code, and then you have to review that. And it's just like that's not how the human brain works. We can't review, let's just be conservative and say, we can't review 1 million lines of code that we didn't write and then look for whether somewhere there's some sort of backdoor into the system that will allow the AGI to do its own nefarious things and kill the Siberian tiger or whatever. No one can actually stay focused on that task for so long. So that's not really going to work. There's this very nice tweet here, fairly recent, that says, you know what the biggest problem with pushing all things AI is? It's the wrong direction. I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can do art and writing, not for AI to do my art and writing so that I can do my laundry and dishes. And this is exactly what we are now being asked to do. I think if you started out, so I realize that some of you may not be programmers here, but be involved in software development for other reasons. But for those of you who are programmers, you probably got into programming because you thought that programming was fun, or exciting, or stimulating, something like that. And then you might be inclined, or you might realize that, there's all of these other things that needs to happen in software development, like we need to do automated testing, and we need to review each other's code, and we need to figure out how to make the code maintainable and so on. So we'll do all of that as well, but sort of like the fun part, the arts and writing part is actually programming. So now again, what we are sort of asking in this sort of scenario where we say the AGI is writing all the code and we're just the reviewers, we're sort of again making this the wrong way around. So we're optimizing for the wrong thing. It's, while programming is fun, it's actually probably not even the hardest thing. Typing is not the hardest part anyway. So maybe that's not the correct place to optimize. Maybe we should optimize somewhere else. Here's a Kevin Henny tweet. So this is not on Twitter, this is on Mastodon. He's talking about LLMs, but I think he has it pretty spot on. You can sort of extrapolate to AGIs also. He says, the practical consequences of using LLMs to generate code is that many developers will find that they have unwittingly moved themselves into a role that they were probably trying to avoid. They have automated the creation of legacy code and have redefined their job as debugging and fixing such code. So you might think about that the next time you think, oh, it's so great, I can just get ChatGPT to write this little routine for me. Yeah, have fun with that, okay? Or rather, maybe don't. So again, I think the direction is the wrong one. So to sum it up here, so this was just a little thought experiment. I'm just, trying to draw from various lessons from science fiction because I thought that, hashtag electric sheep dream sort of made me think in that way. And I think we can learn some things or two. But again, I'm not saying that I'm right about any of these things, so this is just my speculation. But basically, what I think we could hope would happen is the following. So also more than a decade ago, the chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov was beaten by a chess supercomputer. What was the name of that? Was it Deep Blue? Maybe, yeah? No one is shouting, no, it's something else. Well, anyway, so let's just say it doesn't really matter. Okay, some super chess computer beat the one of the best chess players in the world, and since that happened, what essentially, that was sort of a threshold that the chess community went through, where after that had happened, no human could beat the best chess computers. But what we have nowadays is that we actually have what they call it cyborg chess. I kid you not, you can also look this up, it's on Wikipedia. And the way that works is that Garry Kasparov and other people have figured out that if you do a team of a super chess computer and a chess grandmaster, that pair is better than any human or any other supercomputer. So such a cyborg team, as they call them, will beat all the super chess computers and will beat all the grandmasters individually. So that sort of combination has something going for it. This may be a temporary equilibrium, we don't know, but it seems like it's been going on like that for a couple of years now. So this might give us hope as developers in the sense that I think that's probably our future as well. And I think, for once in a blue moon, Microsoft actually got something right when they called it GitHub Copilot and not sort of like Enterprise Programming Assistant, version pack 3. A Copilot is a really nice picture of what it is that we are probably looking into. And they might be more competent in the future, but I think, and I hope that that's sort of the way that things are gonna be. So, at the moment, we have, you can think of, we have a mass of all the code that's ever been written today, and most of it has still been written by humans. So we have a little bit of AI-generated code now, but the vast volume of all the code that's ever been written so far, it was probably written by human beings. So what's going to happen in the future? Now, to be honest, I think we're probably going to have a lot of AGI-generated code, because I've been talking about alignment so far, and I've given you some examples where I say, well, what if we have automated weapon systems? What if we have medical device drivers? What if we have autonomous vehicles and all sorts of things that are mission critical in some way? And we probably want to make sure that we have the software being aligned with our own self-interests. But there's going to be a lot of software where that probably doesn't matter, and we can just say, well, AGI, just do that for us. Create our new computer games, because if they're not entertaining, then, well, what's the harm in that? We'll just not play them, or whatever. You can definitely hear that I'm not a computer gamer myself. Anyways, so we might have a vastly more code that was generated by some sort of AGI system or some sort of expert system. Okay, so that's fair, but does that mean that developers will be redundant? And I don't think so, really. I think there might still be a room for all those mission-critical pieces of software where we need humans to be involved together with the computers to write them. And we could maybe call this artisanal software. So I think this is where we are still deciding what needs to be done. We are still writing the code, or we are writing the code in collaboration with the Copilot, and then we still have a sense of what's happening, and then we can make sure that perhaps that we still have a good alignment, and the software that we're creating will be in our best interests. But then on the other hand, humans wrote Facebook, so I don't know how well that's going to go. But anyways, those were the thoughts that I had for you today. So thanks for coming, thanks for listening, and I hope the rest of the conference will be great for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Well, it was a great presentation. One question: what if the AGI generated code will be reviewed by other AGI generated code, like a team?
So what if AGI code will be reviewed by other AGI code?
Yeah,
Well,
and not by the human.
well, you still have this alignment problem, don't you? I mean, how do you know that your reviewer AGI has your best interest in mind? It might start collaborating with the other AGI through some backdoor that you're not aware of, and then they'll figure out how to maximize the paperclips.
Yeah, that's true. But I was thinking that if in a world that all the code is generated possibly by AGI, the human will still programming, and probably just programming for fun. And we might end up, like put, software made by a human being and not by AGI, so you can sell it like this, maybe. What do you think?
So I'm not sure that I get what you.
So to have a stamp, this software was made by the human team and not by AGI, at some point.
Oh, so you're thinking about we have some sort of certification process, or
this is more eco than another, or things like
that.
that.
That might actually be a good idea to actually have certified human, code.
Yeah, so no AI code, just human, and then AI generated.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that sounds quite reasonable actually. I want such a maybe I should start such a we can do that.
Yeah, we can. Next time we can. Okay, so do you have any question in the room? Okay, I'll just go here.
No?
Test. Okay. Hello, thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering if what you're saying is that there will always be jobs in QA.
There will always be what? I'm sorry?
Jobs in QA.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that, yeah. So the way that I think about QA at the moment is that I'm not thinking about quality assurance as being a separate role. The way that I've worked with software for the last 15 to 20 years is by doing continuous integration, continuous delivery, test-driven development, all those kinds of things, and that sort of have quality assurance built into the process. So nowadays you call it DevOps, I suppose. But yes, you're right. I mean, I think the horror scenario, if those are the only jobs that are left, it's only the QA jobs. Because that was basically the argument I made at a certain point. Yeah. So that's the only development jobs left. That's just only QA, and then you can suffer through that or be unemployed. Yeah, that's not a nice thought, but you might be right. This is just, I'm just trying to think aloud here in order to figure out whether this can inspire some thoughts for other people. And you just had a little inspired thought there as well. A dark one, I suppose, but still. So thanks for that. I hope that was a good enough response for you.
Okay, thank you as well for the presentation. Do you think that giving the AI a body could solve the alignment problem, like have them have a more human experience, like being brought up in the favelas, going to therapy, then?
Yeah, so, well, yeah, I actually thought about that when I was doing this talk, and then I thought, okay, I don't have time to think about that. But I actually think you are onto something there, because one of the problems that we have at the moment is that we humans have, an experience with the real world that sort of, that feedback mechanisms informs us how we should deal with society and with the physical world and other people and so on. And that's also sort of how I think about AGI or AI at the moment, is that I think you probably can't really have AGI unless you also have some sort of existence that goes with it. So there's this other viewpoint that's called substrate independence that a lot of people, thinkers in this field, seem to think about, where they say, well, but it's just a brain is just a processing machine, and if we could somehow figure out how that works, we transfer it to another substrate. So instead of running on, grease, basically fats, it's going to run on silicon somewhere, and then that would be the same. That's the argument that other people have, and they call that substrate independence. And I think exactly we have this problem that the way that, the reason why we have a certain view of the world is because we've grown through all our lives, taking in all the information that comes via all our sensory apparatus. And I think if we don't have that sort of experience, at least we would not arrive at the same kind of intelligence. At the very least, we would have another kind of intelligence. And then again, we're running into this kind of alignment problem. But even if we give them, I think maybe one of the types of systems that are most realistically might run into this kind of system is actually autonomous vehicles, because autonomous vehicles actually will have some sort of interaction with the real physical world. So maybe in 20 or 30 years, they might actually evolve into something that is also embedded in that experience. But then again, the question is that a good existence? Being a self-driving car, is that actually something that the self-driving car wants to be, or would it rather not exist at all? So again, we still have that kind of alignment problem, but maybe we'll get a little bit closer to understand how to interact with those kinds of systems. So, yeah, I hope that sort of gives you enough of a response to make you happy. So,
ladies and gentlemen, Mark Seaman, thank you very much, Mark, for your presentation.